In the sun-drenched suburbs of Florida, where palm trees sway over manicured lawns, the Mericle family appeared to be the seemingly perfect embodiment of the American dream. Suzanne Renee Mericle and her husband John were a couple neighbors admired, successful, stable, and deeply rooted in their community. Their home was a sanctuary of order, a place where life followed a predictable rhythm. But as the shadows lengthened over their quiet street, the polished exterior began to crack, revealing a foundation built on simmering resentment and a hidden domestic turbulence that no one on the outside could have imagined. For years, the Mericles maintained a flawless public image. Yet, behind the heavy wooden doors of their residence, a different, darker story was unfolding, and the defense would later describe a marriage that had devolved into a psychological battlefield, characterized by a slow, agonizing erosion of trust. Suzanne lived in a state of constant dread, a prison where John's presence felt increasingly like a shadow looming over her. The air was heavy with unspoken threats, an emotional strain that had been building for years, transforming their home from a place of comfort into a pressure cooker of intimidation. The tension reached its breaking point on October 4th, 2013. The day started like any other, but by evening the atmosphere inside the household grew thick with a familiar, suffocating hostility. What began as a mundane disagreement soon spiraled out of control. The argument moved through the house, a verbal dance of accusations and biting bitterness. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the conflict reached a fever pitch. Feeling trapped and fearing what might happen next, Suzanne reached for a firearm. She followed John toward the bedroom, her heart hammering against her ribs, the cold weight of the gun a terrifying reality. John entered the room and closed the door, a solid barrier of wood between them. In a moment of frantic decision, Suzanne raised the weapon and pulled the trigger. A single deafening crack shattered the silence. An unmistakable bullet tore through the wooden grain of the bedroom door, ending John Mericle's life in a heartbeat. The silence that followed was even more profound than the noise. Moments later, the urgent voice of Suzanne Mericle reached the ears of a 911 dispatcher. Her tone was a blend of panic and a strange urgency. She spoke of a fight, of fear, and of a desperate need to protect herself. To the operator, she sounded like a woman whose world had just collapsed. Yet her initial explanations were already forming the basis of a defense that would eventually be scrutinized by the entire state. When responders arrived at the scene, they found a house that looked exactly like its neighbors, except for the flashing lights staining the driveway. As investigators stepped across the threshold, they were met with a chilling sight. John Mericle lay motionless on the floor, but he was not in the hallway. He was behind the closed door. This discovery immediately cast a shadow over Suzanne's claim of self-defense. If the door was closed, was John truly an imminent threat? Could a wooden barrier have been enough to de-escalate the situation without lethal force? You, as forensic experts, mapped the crime scene, measuring the trajectory of the bullet and the positioning of the body. A disturbing realization took hold. The physical evidence did not seem to align with the story of a woman facing an immediate, life-threatening assault. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. The investigation was just beginning, and the deeper the police looked, the more the perfect life of the Mericles seemed to be a carefully constructed lie, one that had ended in a tragedy that would soon force a jury to decide the true meaning of fear. The transition from a suburban home to a sterile courtroom was a jarring reality for Suzanne Renee Mericle. Handcuffs marking the end of her life as a respected neighbor. She stood accused of a crime that shocked the community. The state attorney's office looked past her claims of terror, seeing instead a woman who had calculated a lethal exit from a marriage she could no longer endure. Charged with second-degree murder, Suzanne faced a legal battle that would strip away every layer of the family's carefully maintained facade. The prosecution's theory was simple. They didn't see a victim acting in frantic survival. Instead, they painted Suzanne as a woman tired of her husband and seeking a definitive solution. They argued she followed John with a weapon, waiting for her moment. To the state, the closing of the bedroom door was John's retreat, not a threat. They contended she didn't fire because she had to, but because she finally could. This wasn't an act of self-defense. It was the execution of a man who believed he was safe. At the center of the trial sat the behind-the-door problem. The bedroom door, scarred by a single bullet hole, became the prosecution's primary witness. They argued that a solid wooden barrier fundamentally changed the nature of the confrontation. Under Florida law, an imminent threat requires immediate danger. The prosecution emphasized that the heavy grain of the wood should have been enough to signal a pause in the hostilities. They asked the jury to visualize the moment. The door shuts, the latch clicks, and the physical proximity is gone. In that separation, the need for lethal force evaporated. Forensic experts provided a clinical analysis of the crime scene. They displayed photographs of the bullet's trajectory, or showing how the projectile moved through the wood into John's chest. The angle suggested a direct, leveled shot from the hallway. The lack of damage to the door's frame indicated John was not trying to break back out. He was simply standing there when the silence was shattered. These facts suggested no physical struggle at the moment of the shooting, creating a difficult hurdle for Suzanne's defense. The defense team countered by invoking Florida's Stand Your Ground laws, framed within the context of psychological abuse. They argued that Suzanne's perception of danger was calibrated by years of John's alleged intimidation. To her, a closed door was not a protection but a temporary delay. They portrayed her as living in a state of constant, heightened alert, where every argument felt like a life-or-death struggle. The defense urged the jury to see a world where the threat didn't end just because a door was closed. A parade of character witnesses added new strokes to the portrait of the marriage. Friends who once envied the couple now spoke of a chilling undercurrent. Some testified to John's volatile temper, while others defended him, painting Suzanne as increasingly erratic. The Mericl family children faced the agonizing reality of seeing their family's darkest secrets laid bare. Each testimony revealed a marriage that was a hollow shell held together by secrets. As the weeks passed, emotional escalation reached a fever pitch. Suzanne's demeanor was under constant scrutiny. When the prosecution played the 911 call, her tears were seen by some as genuine grief and by others as a calculated performance. The jury watched a woman whose life had been a controlled narrative lose control of her own story. Just before the climax, a suspenseful turn shifted the momentum. The prosecution introduced specific financial records, revealing the family was drowning in debt. These documents painted a grim picture of a lifestyle crumbling under its own weight. More shocking was a substantial life insurance policy on John. Suddenly, the narrative of fear was complicated by a potential financial motive. The jury was now left to wonder if the shot was fired out of terror or if it was a desperate act to secure a future that John was no longer part of forever. The courtroom held its collective breath as Suzanne Renee Mericle walked to the witness stand. And this was the moment everyone had waited for. The chance to hear the woman behind the door explain the inexplicable. She spoke in a voice that was soft, almost fragile, recounting years of what she described as a slow, suffocating fear. She painted John not as the successful man the neighbors knew, but as a looming shadow that grew more menacing with every passing year. She told the jury that on that October night, she did not see a simple door. She saw a temporary barrier that was about to break under the weight of his rage. To Suzanne, the gun was her only voice in a house where she had been silenced for far too long. She claimed her finger pulled the trigger almost instinctively, driven by a primal need to prevent the next blow she was certain was coming. However, the prosecution was ready to dismantle her fragile narrative. The cross-examination was sharp and unrelenting. They played back the 911 call, highlighting moments where her panic seemed to shift into cold, rhythmic calculation. They pointed out the glaring inconsistencies between her initial statement to the police and the testimony she was now offering. If she were truly paralyzed by fear, they asked, why did she follow him? Why didn't she run out the front door or call for help before the situation turned lethal? They brought back the financial records, suggesting firearm was not a tool of survival, but a key to a substantial life insurance policy that would solve her mounting debts. To the state, the motive was not fear, but freedom and fortune. Every piece of evidence suggested a calculated move, rather than a desperate reaction. During closing arguments, the defense made a final plea for empathy. They asked the jury to consider the invisible bruises of psychological abuse. They argued that Suzanne was a victim who finally snapped under a lifetime of pressure. In contrast, the prosecution's closing was a stark demand for justice. They stood before the jury and pointed to the physical evidence, the door that should have been a sanctuary for John. They reminded the court that John Mericl was shot in his home through a closed door at the hall's end, without the chance to defend himself. He died in the dark, they argued, because his wife decided his life was an obstacle to her desires regarding a man who was once her partner. The jury retreated into a room that held the fate of two families in the balance. For hours, the Mericl children waited in the hallways. The 12 men and women struggled to reconcile the image of a terrified wife with the cold reality of a bullet hole through a barrier. The definition of an imminent threat was the pivot upon which Suzanne's future turned. When the jury finally returned, the air in the courtroom felt heavy. As the clerk read the words, "guilty of second-degree murder," Suzanne's face remained a mask of shock, while gasps erupted from the gallery. The behind-the-door defense had failed. The jury decided that a wooden barrier should have been the end of the conflict, not the catalyst for a fatal killing. At the sentencing hearing, the judge noted the tragedy but emphasized the finality of Suzanne's choice. She was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. For a woman of her age, it was effectively a life sentence, and suburban dream had officially transformed into a permanent cell. The aftermath left a hollowed-out legacy. Two parents were gone, one to a cold grave and one to the penitentiary. The Mericl children were left to navigate a world where their family name was synonymous with a landmark legal battle. This case serves as a haunting reminder of the thin line between protection and homicide. Suzanne continues her appeals, yet the verdict stands as a grim testament to a marriage that ended in the ultimate silence.